we'll go ahead and get started. The good news is that I don't have another defense at 10:30, so but I don't really know whether you guys are busy at 10:30. So in any sense, we're gonna get started. Maybe I can just introduce John. Okay, yeah. So John is a master's student in the software engineering master's program at CITSI, and so he completed his bachelor's degrees at ASU. He was part of honors college, Barrett Honors College, and so he's currently completing his 4+1 program. So John did his bachelor as double major in engineering and software engineering, and so he continues with software engineering as his master's concentration. So he has been working in my lab since fall 2017, if I remember correctly, and or maybe, yeah, I think fall 2017. So so he has been working on building the hardware, firmware, software of this new robotic motorcycle or robotic bicycle. And so today he's gonna present his work in physical human bicycle interfaces for robotic balance assistance. So with that, John, I'm gonna like to take it from here.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Professor. So now I'll give a little introduction as well. So the background of this project, there are a few different points here, but bicycles provide compact, affordable, and sustainable transportation and recreation. And this is in contrast to traditional automobiles, which are very large. They're not necessarily inexpensive, and they have sustainability issues. And also, if someone suffers from stroke or Parkinson's disease or other ailments which might impact human balance performance, they'll also have difficulty with cycling. So previous research has shown that bicycle training can be an effective way to provide balance rehabilitation, and this can be accomplished through training on a real bicycle outside or on a specially instrumented stationary bicycle. And then providing automatic balance assistance to riders will also make cycling more accessible for those with disabilities in general. Okay, and then autonomous bicycles also provide a good exercise opportunity for grad students. This was a previous development in the Smart Bicycle project that started back in fall of 2017, and this shows our previous steering balance system in action. So some research questions that I developed are: how can we identify the rider's steering intent from the interaction forces? So if we're going to be providing balance assistance to the rider by controlling the steering, we still want the rider to be able to maneuver the bicycle freely in the direction that they want to go. And in order to do that, we need to figure out what their intent is. And a constraint on that is we want to do it with non-invasive sensors. So we don't want to have like wearable sensors that you have to apply all over the person's body to figure out what they want to do. And then we also want to study how healthy cyclists respond to induced bicycle steering disturbances. So this means that if you're riding along and you go over a bump or something twists your steering, how do you react to that? And so I looked at developing a method for inducing repeatable steering disturbances on the human bicycle interaction bike. And then lastly, as a kind of second part to this thesis, how can controllable balance assistance be provided in a self-contained bicycle system? And this should be accomplished with stationary and moving balance control modes, one with a control moment gyroscope that generates internal non-anchored torque within the system to keep the bike upright, and also with steering control, which changes the steering direction of the bike while it's in motion. So a little bit of related work. On the human bike interaction side, Chen and his colleagues used the limb positions and they wanted to predict the limb positions and the trunk position based on the geometric constraints of the human body and also of the bicycle. And so they did this by using a wearable IMU on the, can you see my cursor? Okay, a wearable IMU on the back of the rider and encoders on the joints in the handlebar and the pedals. And so with this information, you can, using a model of the human body and the bike frame, you can estimate the joint positions. And they did this with a machine learning derived extended Kalman filter. The main disadvantage of this method is that you have to have the wearable IMU on the back, and that has to be carefully positioned. And then Stone and Hull looked at the force, the interaction force loads between the bike rider and the pedals, specifically in the seated and standing positions. And then Kim developed a bicycle rehabilitation system that uses a simulated environment for helping people improve their postural balance. Okay, then on the self-balancing side, there's been quite a bit more done in this area with different methods of balancing. The one that we've chosen is the control moment gyroscope here, which uses a spinning flywheel and gimbal to change the direction of the angular momentum in the flywheel, and that generates the balancing torque. But we also have a reaction wheel, which accelerates a flywheel to generate torque. The disadvantage of this is that it has high power consumption because you're constantly changing the velocity of this wheel. And then there's steering balance control, which is adopted here for in motion balancing. This is not a very good picture, but this is all they had for that paper. But the bike's on rollers here, and they can change the steering angle to bring the wheel contact patch back under the center of mass of the bike. And then lastly, we have a mass balancer, which uses a heavy mass swinging back and forth on top of the bike. This is kind of effective. It's similar to how a person might control a bike if they're riding it without their hands on the handlebar. But for our purpose, since we want to also have a human on the bike in this area, it wouldn't be very useful, and it might also be scary for the rider to have this mass swinging around near them. Okay, so the scope is basically divided into two parts. I'm looking at the how can we address these problems with an embedded systems approach. For the comprehensive human-bicycle interaction system, I developed special instrumentation to capture the seat, handlebar, and pedal forces, and to capture the joint angles on the bike, as well as the inertial measurements, which include the bicycle rotation in space and the acceleration and velocity of the bike as well. And then I worked on embedded systems design for an implementation of an under-actuated self-balancing bicycle robot with robotic steering, control moment gyroscope for stationary balancing, and embedded control software that will allow us to easily extend this system in the future and to conduct controlled experiments. And then I'll present some preliminary test results as well. So the outline's basically going through those things in order. Okay, I'll start with human-bicycle interaction. Okay, so for the seat, this is work that was previously started during my honors thesis, and the seat contains 3 load cells positioned in a triangular configuration. And the advantage of this, instead of just having one load cell on the seat post, which is the approach adopted by most people studying like biomechanics and sports medicine. If we have 3, we can track the center of pressure on the seat. So if you lean forward on the bike, that shifts the center of pressure towards the front. And similarly, if you lean to the right, that shifts the center of pressure to the right. So with these 3 sensors, we can get a lot more useful information out of the seat forces than just having a single seat force sensor. Then for the handlebar, we're doing a similar thing. We're measuring the force applied in 3 dimensions with this multi-axis load cell. This figure here shows the evolution of the design from the initial concept with 2 3-axis load cells mounted inside of a large shield to after I determined that it was only necessary to have a single load cell. Simplification of that design, and then due to the lack of availability of this sensor, I switched to using a F3G sensor from Forcentech, which is shown here, and that's encased in a protective shroud. So this shows the actual implementation of this system here. So we have the bicycle handle grip and the brake, and these represent the primary handlebar contact points between the rider and the bicycle handlebar, and those are coupled to the bike handlebar through the 3-axis load cell. This sensor has a plus or minus 1 kilonewton sensor range, which should be enough to detect any forces that the rider would be capable of applying during normal bicycle operation. And it also has a 1 millivolt per volt sensitivity, which means that for every volt of excitation, current voltage that you apply across the bridge in the load cell, you'll get 1 millivolt out at the full sensor range. Then for providing the controllable perturbation, we adopted the robotic steering mechanism from the previous self-balancing bicycle design, which has a which contains steering motor on the left, and we can control the current applied to this motor to produce a controlled steering torque, and this can be repeated through successive experiments with different riders, and that will give useful information about how they respond to steering disturbances. Okay, lastly, we need to look at the forces that are applied between the rider and the bicycle pedals. So this is an interesting problem because there are several ways to do this. One way is to have a torque sensor on the shaft that measures the torque transmitted from the pedal into the bicycle drivetrain, and then you can work back by figuring out what the pedal crank position is and the length of the crank to get the force. However, that approach also relies on having an additional encoder to measure the angle of the pedal in relation to the bicycle crank. So the approach that I adopted was to install a pedal force sensor directly on top of the bicycle. So this is the Forcentech FCB pedal load cell, which also has a 1 kilonewton range, and that's mounted on top of this split mount here, which clamps around the bicycle pedal and allows any forces applied to the pedal to be measured directly. Then I also have a rotary encoder here, which meshes with this split gear, which you can install on the bike after it's been assembled. And that's simply so that we can know the position that the cranks are in, because that's important when you're accounting for pedal forces within the human bicycle interaction model. Okay, so we'll look a little bit at the data acquisition system here. So load cells are a really simple mechanism. You've got like a piece of metal and then it's machined in such a way that when you apply a force to that piece of metal, it bends in a controlled way. And so they apply a strain gauge, which is a fine wire across the bending section of the metal, and when the length of that changes, it changes the resistance across this quarter of the Wheatstone bridge, which produces a output voltage, and then we can feed all of those output signals into a analog to digital converter using a multiplexer, and that allows us to figure out what the force applied to the load cell was. Okay, so we have a choice to make here when it comes to selecting the right analog to digital converter for this application. Normally, you could use a successive approximation register ADC, which basically does a binary search on the input voltage. And the advantage of this is that it's pretty fast, but it's also not highly precise, which is important when you're dealing with things that are like in the sub-millivolt range. So we could deal with that with like a preamplifier that'll amplify the input signal and then feed it into the ADC, or we can go with a ADC capable of reading smaller voltages, which is what I've done here. So I'm using a delta sigma analog to digital converter, which basically produces a bit stream, which the ratio of like high to low corresponds to the input voltage, and then it's fed into a digital filter which averages that value over time, and so you can get very precise readings that way. But we have a little trade-off to make, because when you're looking at the width of the output value, the SAR ADC is on the order of n, so you have like n steps to get n bits out. But for this, you have to take like 2 to the n samples in order to get n bits out. However, the simplicity of the delta sigma modulator means that you can take these samples a lot faster than you can with these. So it is slower, but it's not like as slow as it would seem. Okay, so here's a little activity diagram for the data acquisition system. It's pretty simple. We just go through the initialization process, and then it enters into an event loop, which checks essentially whether the previous conversion from the ADC is finished. And if it has, it saves that result for the given input, selects the next input, then it continues and checks whether the sample timer has expired or not. And if it has, then it sends all of the previously acquired data to the PC for logging, and continues through that process. And this enables us to have the highest possible sample rate the ADC will provide, but also send the data at a consistent rate, so we can easily correlate that with any motion capture data that we collect. Okay, so for the previous section, it was cut a little short by the pandemic, because I wanted to conduct more tests with motion capture, and I only got some of the sensors last week. So because of that, I've spent a lot more time working on the self-balancing aspect of this project as well. So I'll go into that now. We started with this previous design where the CMG, the control moment gyroscope, was mounted on the back of the bicycle in a very high position. And the thinking behind this was that there's not room to put the CMG down here, and if we put it in the back, that'll still leave room for the rider to sit in the front. But the problem is that this box and the flywheel, when installed, are very heavy, and that raises the center of mass of the bike. And when the center of mass is higher, that also means that the moment of inertia from the ground contact axis is a lot larger, and that makes the system more difficult to control. So to address that, we selected a new bicycle frame where the CMG can be mounted very low in the frame. In fact, the position of the center of mass of this CMG box is almost aligned with the center of mass of the bicycle frame just by itself. So the addition of this CMG doesn't raise the center of mass as it did with the previous design. And this makes the system a lot easier to balance. And if we add a seat on here and some foot pegs on the side of the CMG, it also gives room for a rider.
So Jonathan,
yeah.
Can you take a question now?
Sure.
Okay. So you said that the having a higher moment of inertia made it harder to control. My understanding, though, from the inverted pendulum problem is that having the mass up at the top, actually, the higher moment of inertia means that your angular change is going to be less. Then it'll be less susceptible to perturbation than if you have a lower center of gravity.
Yes.
What do you mean by the statement that it's harder to control?
Okay, what I meant is that it would require a higher input torque to counteract the same amount of angular displacement.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so within the power subsystem, we have 3 different voltage rails. One is unregulated 48 volt DC from the battery, and that powers the CMG actuators, which are the gimbal motor and the flywheel motor. And the battery is connected through a kill switch relay setup here so that we can shut off all the power in case an unsafe condition arises. And then we have regulated 24 volts DC for the robotic steering and for onboard computer that we plan to install in the future for higher level controls. And then there's 5 volts DC for the microelectronics on the bike. Okay, so here's an overview of the evolution of the robotic steering system. So this is the previous design that I already showed. And then for the new bike, I moved the motor to the side here and so that we could position it underneath. This is basically this design but flipped upside down. However, this motor would interfere with the fork design on the new bike, so the motor was moved into this position. This system is very compact and it can be mounted on the bike without any frame modifications, and it also allows the steering to be controlled with minimal impedance if we just wanted to ride the bike around and log the data from the encoder. Okay, then the control moment gyroscope. This is the core piece of the work done here. So this contains a flywheel here, which spins at 465 radians per second. And then there's this large gear here, which transmits torque from the gimbal motor to the flywheel gimbal. And that causes the gimbal to twist around, which changes the orientation of the angular momentum, creating a torque within the system. And so this is an improvement from previous designs. This is the initial design with a dual CMG, which is very bulky and large, and it was determined that having 2 flywheels is unnecessary for this system because we can just make one more compact and spin a little faster, and then we can get the same results that we could have with this system in a smaller package. This is the design for the previous bike in the high mounted position. Okay, then we'll move on to the sensors that are used within the system. So the most important sensor is the inertial measurement unit, which gives us information about the bicycle angle, the roll of the bike, and also of the angular velocity. And these are inputs to the balance controller. So initially, we were using BNO055 absolute orientation IMU. This is a sensor that's commonly used in phones and gaming controllers and things like that. However, this sensor has a simple complementary filter implementation and is fairly low accuracy with like maximum error of up to 5 degrees, which is not suitable for this application. So we switched over to Pixhawk flight controller, which has an improved IMU with a maximum error of about 0.5 degrees, and it uses an extended Kalman filter, which has much higher performance than the BNO055. Then we also have an encoder which gives position feedback to the motor controller and to the balance controller. Okay, and then actuators in the CMG. We use high torque motors, brushless DC motors with this O-drive robotics high power motor controller. And the advantage of this unit over the previous approach of using brushed motors and standalone motor drivers for each motor is that we can connect everything, the encoders and the motors, to this single module, and then using the O-drive API and the C library that I wrote to interface with this, we can control the entire CMG over one serial link, as opposed to like many different separate control signals that were required in the previous designs. So this is just a broad overview of the interconnections between all of the different electrical components within the system. At the bottom, you have the different power rails, and so everything here runs off of 5 volts, and then all this stuff runs off of the 24-volt circuit, so that includes the robotic steering, and then everything here runs off the 48-volt system, and everything is connected over serial. This is just a regular like ASCII command system where we can send data back and forth, over text. It's parsed here, and then the IMU uses a special Mavlink communication system, which was also ported to work with the PSOC development kit. Okay, so here are a few pictures of the actual implementation of this system. We've got the whole bike on the left, and then the close-up on the right with the O-drive here, and the control circuitry, the emergency stop, our IMUs here, and this is the gimbal motor. All right, so now we'll get a little bit more into the embedded software. So we chose to use a Cypress PSOC because that is a microcontroller that's already used within the robotics program here, and it also has a high degree of customizability and interoperability. So we can use these configurable digital blocks to define the interface between the CPU and external hardware components in pretty much any way that we want. This is in contrast to standard microcontroller, which offers a set of like predefined interfaces that we can use. So if we want, for instance, to have a lot of PWM outputs, we can define as many as those as we want, pretty much. And in this case, we have interfaces with the magnetic encoder, the steering motor controller, the O-drive, and external buttons through a hardware debouncer. And then we can also communicate with other computing devices over a USB CDC interface or through a regular UART. Okay, the software is divided into a few primary components, which are separated into different files. The main file contains all of the high-level balance control logic, including the CMG controller and the steering controller, as well as like initialization routines. And then I've provided an API for communication with the O drive, and this contains implementations of all of the different control modes for the O drive. So this allows us to control the velocity of the motors directly, as well as ramping with predetermined current and position control. Then for the steering, we can either run it in regular closed loop mode where we set a steering target and it holds the steering at that angle, or we can run it in open loop mode, which allows us to set the steering power. And this is useful, the open loop mode is useful for the steering balance control, stationary steering balance control algorithm, where we use a torque generated by twisting the handlebars to balance the bike while it's stationary. Then we also have the NavLink library, which is used for interfacing with the IMU. Okay, I've got a short video here showing the startup procedure, so I'll play that. Can you hear the video?
Can't hear. No, can't hear it. Can see it.
Okay, so I'll just explain what's going on here. We start by pressing this trigger button here on the bike, and that will perform an O-drive calibration routine where it rotates the brushless DC motors to determine the alignment of the motor poles with the encoder disk. And this enables what's called censored brushless DC motor control, where it can, since it knows where the pole positions are, it can apply voltage across those poles to give very precise position and velocity control of the motor. Okay, so then it'll tell us to press the button to start the flywheel. This will start the flywheel spin-up operation, where the flywheel is gradually spun up to its target RPM. That takes a few seconds. After the flywheel has reached the target RPM, then we can start the balance controller. And I have this interface here which lets us adjust the control gains in the PID controller in real time during testing, which is a major advantage because previously if we wanted to change the control gains, we'd have to edit the source code and recompile it and re-flash the microcontroller and go through the whole startup routine again, which could take like up to 5 minutes or more per trial. But now, in a few seconds, we can adjust the gains. Okay, so then we'll start the balance controller here, and you'll see the gains are very low right now, but now the bike is trying to balance itself. This is just a demonstration and it's not well tuned yet, but if we want to stop the flywheel quickly, then we can press the white button again, and that'll spin down the flywheel with dynamic braking, where all of the energy in the flywheel is fed into this power resistor here, and then we can shut it off with the emergency stop. So that's an overview of how we run our tests in a safe way. Okay, now moving on to a little bit of the controls. So The system utilizes a cascaded PID controller. I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of depth on this because this was not the primary focus of my thesis, but I think it's still useful to understand what's going on here. So we have an outer PID loop which is used to stabilize the roll angle of the bike, which is phi B here. And so if the bike is leaning to the side, that will drive the rotation of the gimbal to create a torque, pushing the bike back to the centered position. But the problem with only having this outer loop is that now the gimbal is twisted over to the side. So we've got like a high phi omega here. And when that approaches plus or minus pi over 2, or 90 degrees from the centered position, then the useful output torque is close to 0. So that means that once we perform that recentering operation, the actuator is saturated. So to counter that, we have an inner PID loop cascaded within this system, which also drives the gimbal position to return back to the center. And so this prevents the the actuator from becoming saturated over time. Okay, so we conducted a few tests with this in a motion capture environment where we can capture the actual bicycle roll, which is indicated here by the red line, and also record the IMU roll simultaneously. And here we have the gains that we used for the experiment. On the right, these are the gains for the robotic steering. In this case, we were only using the CMG, so all of the gains here are set to 0. With this fairly simple control structure, we were able to balance the bike for up to 8 seconds during our primary testing. So here's a little video showing the bike balancing. Okay, so we let go of the bike here, and then it's staying upright. Okay, and then it falls. Okay, so now we've reached the end. In the future, since there were setbacks with the shipment of the sensors, I didn't get to run all of the tests that I wanted to with the sensor system. So the first thing would be to finish that up, and when the motion capture drone studio at the Tempe campus opens back up, go in there and collect data with that system that could be useful for validating human bicycle interaction models and gaining better insights into how humans control bikes. And then hopefully some of the knowledge from that can be applied back to control systems for developing a more robust controllers for stationary and in-motion balancing of bicycles. Then some more things to do would be to create like trajectory and path planning algorithms to help the bike navigate autonomously or semi-autonomously. For instance, if you're biking down the road and there's an obstacle that you don't see but the bike sees it, it could perform some action to prevent you from crashing. And then lastly would be to integrate the human bicycle interaction system and the self-balancing system so that this single integrated system could be used for rehabilitation or autonomous transportation. So the impact of my work is I designed and implemented a comprehensive human bicycle interaction monitoring system, which is useful for human bike interaction research. And then I designed, implemented, and tested a self-balancing bicycle system with robotic steering and a control moment gyroscope, which we've just seen, and developed modular systems with safety and maintainability as high priorities. The previous design was pretty monolithic, and like everything was tightly coupled together, and it was hard to improve the system without making a bunch of changes throughout. But now all of the components are fairly decoupled and can be easily interchanged as necessary. And this allows these systems to be adapted for additional research purposes in the future with applications in bike controls and rehabilitation. Okay, thank you. And with that, I'll take some questions.
Yeah, I've got a question for you. I know this was not directly related to your work, but has anyone done any characterization of the response of the bicycle? So, I'm thinking of classical control systems, impulse response, because that actually does set some constraints on the software that you write and the response times and the frequency response of your software for controlling the bike.
Yes, I believe that has been done. I did not look too much into that area, but I know some work actually has been done with using CMGs to apply like a step disturbance to the bike, and then using that to characterize the system response. And
Okay.
that's also been done with like human-bike interaction. There was a group at Rutgers University which put a CMG on the back of the bike, and then they'd have a participant riding that bike, and then they could induce a torque with that, and then they could also look at that response.
Okay. It seems to me also related to this system that you've come up with, understanding, and I don't mean stability in the informal sense, but I mean stability in the control system sense. How or what are the domains where your control system is stable, right? Because you showed us an example of the bicycle falling over after 8 seconds. Well, there's lots of different load configurations of the bicycle. When you put a rider on it, it's going to change the moment of inertia. How does that change the poles of the system? Is it going to be stable? And then related to that is your control loop and your sensor latencies. How is that going to be stable? So I see a whole other domain of future work that can be done there before you start using this in larger, actual deployment with people on the bicycles.
Thank you.
Jonathan, first, thank you for the presentation. I had a few questions. So staying in the topic, you mentioned that you were able to get the balancing for about 8 seconds. Which issues do you see, or what is the reason why it's just 8 seconds and not longer? Do you know what could be improved or changed, or what's the issue for extending that period, or how that could be extended?
Yeah, so there are a few possible causes for that. One is the accumulation of noise in the IMU. So over time, the roll angle estimation from the IMU drifts, and so it thinks the bike is upright, but it's actually leaning a bit to the side, and that causes the actuator to become saturated. Another possible cause is the CMG oscillating at the resonant frequency of the bike, and this causes like, let me see if I can go back here. As you can see, the magnitude of these oscillations increases over time, and so working to dampen those oscillations either by changes to the controller or by implementing some sort of physical damper on the CMV system itself could be possible solutions to mitigate that.
It appears, it appears like your PID is too, the proportional portion of the PID and maybe the differential is too high.
I have another question. So initially in your presentation, you presented some related work and showed like shortcomings of other approaches, and obviously that led to how you tackled the problem or the specific aspects of the project that you focused on. For example, not having any sensors attached to the driver, instead everything is attached to the bike itself. Were there any parts of the related work that you used for your or like specific things that were already have been researched and solutions have been found, was there something that you could reuse and apply during your work on the thesis?
Yes, there were several things such as the measurement of, I mean, this setup, they measured the forces in slightly different ways, but they had a force sensor in the center of the handlebar, and as well as the torque sensor for the pedals, and then a force sensor on the seat post. So our sensor configuration is similar. However, I have added additional sensors so we can capture more force information. And the idea behind that is that we can hopefully use that additional force information to compensate for the lack of IMU on the rider trunk.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, this is Jorge Caviedes. First of all, great work, very interesting. It's like a fun project. I am a professor, research professor in CITSE. 2 points: the transition between the analog control system and the digital does require some work to understand the time constants and the mechanisms of control.
Mm-hmm.
To that effect, there are 2 steering techniques. One is the shifting of the center of gravity, and the other one is the steering, the position of the handlebars.
Yes.
And you have those 2 things. You have done work on basically a track stand,
Right.
In a more realistic scenario, maybe you can look at the treadmill type of setup where the bike, it's not quite like the rollers, but it's a more realistic simulation where you ride the bike to understand the demands of the balancing and the 2 control systems. Basically, you could control by just shifting your body, or you can control by steering, and those 2 need to be combined, and the balancing solution is not unique.
Correct.
So very interesting aspects going forward is what I'm saying, but great work, thanks.
Right.
Yeah, Jonathan, I think this is a great work as well.
Yeah, so I think, John, you probably also want to comment a little bit on the future vision of this project. And I think as mentioned by the committee and the researcher, by other audience, I think one of the vision is to combine the controllable gyroscope with steering, right? And I think maybe in your dissertation, you should also, not dissertation, sorry, in your thesis, you should mention very clearly, okay, yes, I'm currently working on the controllable gyroscope, and I'm working on building all these sensors, but the long-term vision is not to only use the CMG to balance the bicycle, right? Because I think the long-term vision is you will combine these 2 mechanisms, and the idea is that the higher the speed is, the higher the forward speed is of the bicycle, the more you're going to rely on the steering mechanism, right? And the lower the speed is, then you'll realize the steering mechanism is less effective, right? So that's why you need to have some ways to do some stationary balancing. So I think you probably also want to, at least in your thesis, make the vision and also the rationale behind what you're doing very clear. Okay, so people will know why you're doing this, because you need to first give people a big picture of, okay, this is the overall idea, but I'm taking a small portion because I need to first understand how that CMG works and how does that shift the dynamics of the bicycle, right? So I think with that, then people will know, okay, then you're working on this sub-problem, but it will eventually lead to a more integrated system, right? So I think that's probably something you want to include in your thesis. And also, I think other committee members have given you very good comments in terms of the control systems, right? And in terms of how you tune the controller, and also you need to explain limitations on why that you can only balance it for 6 to 8 seconds, especially if in a literature review, some other researchers are able to balance the bicycle for longer time. You probably want to elaborate a little bit more of the challenges that you're specifically facing with this bicycle and with the hardware, right? So make sure that people understand the effort you put there, and people understand the novelty of the work, I guess. Okay. So yeah, and this is just to the community, right? I think we were planning to actually iterate these sensors, and we were hoping to run some testing in the drone space in Tempe, but because of the lockdown, John can't really run these experiments. So we also, and that was also part of the reason why we focus a bit more on the stationary balancing, so that we don't need a large space to test the motorcycle, right? Because when you ask the bicycle to move forward, then you actually need a big space, and there's some safety concerns. So I think, but I guess I agree with the community that this is overall a very great job. If there are no other questions or from the general audience, you do have one.
I would have one more question. So just going back to your initially in your presentation, you mentioned that you had a total of 3 research questions, and the first 2 were the steering intent and how to do the steering intent, and the second was how drivers would respond to the steering disturbance while they're driving. So in the presentation, obviously, I think that was related what you mentioned due to not getting the sensors in time due to the pandemic. I'm just curious about the future work aspect. Do you plan on still finish or being able to, do you think you will be able to answer these research questions before the deadline of your thesis, or is that more unlikely?
I think it's more unlikely that I'll be able to give a very good answer to these questions before the deadline, but I would hope to be able to collect some experimental data that will help with answering these questions in the future.
Okay, so at least to give like an outlook or like a certain outline for the first research question, getting some data once you get the sensor, hopefully in time, at least measure some data, preliminary data that you could present in your thesis?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I think that's going to be the plan, right, John? So we'll probably try to collect some data. We have to figure out how we can get access and maybe where we can test these stuff. I think in the worst case, we'll probably just have to run the bicycle outside.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, when the deadline is in 10 days, so this might be tough to finish the thesis and still do the measurements. So I was just curious about how the current state is and what the plans are. So thank you.
Thanks, Robert. So, okay, if there are no other questions, then John will have to let you step out of this room very quickly, where that's when the committee discuss the decision for your defense. And in the meantime, I would like to also thank everyone else for joining John's defense this morning and asking great questions. And with that, John, please leave the room, but make sure you don't end the meeting for all. I'm going to give you well, I learned that from my student.
Maybe you can create a breakout room with us 3. That might be possible.
Yeah, I think I can do that.
And then we have a separate room.
I can create a room. No, I might have co-host.
You should be the co-host. Let me see. I'll assign you guys to a breakout room.
Yep.
Thank you. And thank you again for the presentation.
Yeah, good job.
Good job.
Thank you.
What?